All right, so now let's see how we can use Django REST Framework to do what we've already done in much less lines of code. So the first thing we're going to want to do is install Django REST Framework. So Control-C to stop the server. We can clear that, and then we can just pip install Django REST Framework, all one word. Perfect. So we have that installed. We can close out the terminal for now. And the first thing we're going to want to do is create something called a serializer. So serialization is just the process of changing data types into other data types. So in this case, we actually serialized items, which was a query object. We serialized it into a list. So the process of serialization is just changing data types into other data types. So for example here, like I said, we changed this query object into a Python list, a Python list of dictionaries. And so something that Django REST Framework comes with is the ability to serialize out of the box. And we can do that with what's called a serializer. So the first thing we're going to want to do is create a new file. So we can do this in another file called serializers.py. So in our menu app, let's create a new file called serializers.py. But before we get started with the serializers, we always want to remember whenever we install a new app or create a new app, we have to add it to our settings.py, project config settings.py, and under installed apps, we want to add rest_framework, like so, the comma. Go ahead and save that. And now we're finished with that. We've got the app added to our app settings. And so now we can go into our serializers.py and create a serializer. So we want to import some things. So from rest framework, rest_framework, import serializers. And then we want to import our item model. So from .models, import item. And if we go back to the view quickly, what we were doing was serializing these items. So that's why when we create this serializers.py, we're going to import our item model so that we can serialize that. And then we create a class, call it item serializer. You can call it whatever you want, but the convention typically is the object getting serializer. And then we want to inherit from serializers dot, and this will be a model serializer since we're serializing a model. And now there's just a few configurations to get this working. We have to set up some meta settings. So class meta, and we specify the model, which is the item, the menu item. And then we need to specify what fields we want to serialize. And so we can pass in _all just to serialize all the fields. And we could save that. And this right here will do pretty much exactly what we did right here, but with 3 lines of code. So now let's look at how we would actually use this in a view. So what we're going to want to do is just create another view. So we'll call this item list serialized. And again, it'll take in request. And again, we'll get all of the items from the database. So item.objects.all. But now we can just serialize them using our item serializer. So we'll say the serializer equals, and it will be item serializer. We pass in what we want to be serialized, and we have to specify if this will have many items or just a single item. In this case, we're having multiple items, so we'll say many equals true. And we're getting this error since we don't know where this is. We need to import item serializer. So at the top, we can just say from .serializers import item serializer, like so. So now we have this serializer, and we passed in the items data. And now we can just return that JSON response that we used previously. And we can just say serializer.data to access the serialized data. And then safe equals false again. So just like that, we have a view set up to list out these items, and we can see the difference in amount of code. So let's go ahead and set up a URL and test this out to see if this new view works. So let's go back into our app urls.py, and we can just duplicate this path here. We can call this DRF for Django REST Framework, but then we also need to import this new view, item list serialized. We can control copy that and paste it right there. So now let's make sure the server is running. Python manage.py run server. And if we open this in our web browser and go to /drf, we should see that this looks exactly the same. So it is this JSON response with all of our data from the database. Perfect. So now let's create another view, this time for a single item on the menu, like an item detail view. So let's create another function here, another view, and we'll call this item detail. And this will take in the request. And then we'll query for a specific item. So item.objects.get, and the ID will equal the primary key, which we will also get. So we'll be able to get the specific item. And now instead of having to manually serialize this item, we can reuse this item serializer for this view as well. So we could say serializer equals item serializer. This time pass in the data item, and we don't need to specify many equals true because it's false by default. So just like that, we have this item object serialized into the correct format. And we could return a JSON response, but a Django REST framework comes with its own response that's a bit more suited. So we can import that at the top. So we could say from REST framework dot response import response. And we can use this response here and just pass in serializer.data. We don't have to specify safe equals false. And just like that, make sure your server's still running. We can add a URL for this. So we can go into our menu urls.py. We can create another path here that takes in an integer that is the primary key. And we want to use the view that we just created, so we can import it as item detail. Copy that over and use that view for this path. We can save that, make sure the server is still running, and then see how this looks in the browser. So now if we go to localhost 8000/1, we're getting this error. Accepted renderer not set on response. And so what we need to do is use another tool from Django REST Framework to specify that this should be a JSON response. And we can do that by using a decorator. So we can import from REST framework.decorators import API view. And what we can do is use this decorator above item list detail. So we could say at API view, and then we pass in acceptable methods for this view as an argument, and it converts these function-based views into a Django REST Framework API view. So right now we'll just say get, save that, and now if we go back to the browser and we refresh the page, whoa, we get this whole new interface. So Django REST Framework also comes with this visual interface for viewing this data. But over here under get, if we go to JSON, we can still see that raw JSON data that we get. But if we don't specify the format or put format as API, then Django REST Framework comes with this nice visual tool to see the data in a nice visual format. So now let's go through quickly refactoring this initial item list so that it uses the Django REST Framework tools that we just built. So we can go ahead and comment this out and create another item list that takes the request. This time, again, we can go ahead and get the items. Items equal item.objects.all. And we can serialize this by using our serializer now. So item serializer, pass in the data, items, and then many equals true. What we want to return is this Django REST Framework response. So we can return this response, and all we have to pass in is this serialized data, serializer.data. The last thing we have to do is use this decorator API view, and we can specify what methods are allowed. And again, we'll just have get, but we could, for instance, say get and post, but we will just say get for now. So we go ahead and save that, and we can just see the difference in the amount of code that we have to write. But let's go ahead and save this, make sure your server's still running, and let's make sure that this worked. If you go back to your web browser and go back to the root domain, it still works, and we get this Django REST Framework view. We can also, again, get the raw JSON file as well.